are not stuck because of them. You are stuck because you still need them to confirm who you are. And that is the truth. Most people are never brave enough to face, because it is much easier to believe the problem is in how they treat you, how they go silent, how they pull away, how they make you wait. But if you are honest, you will notice something repeating. You are not checking your phone because they are that important. You are checking because their response decides how you feel about yourself. You are not waiting for a message. You are waiting for confirmation that you matter enough to be remembered, that you are valuable enough to be chosen, that you are significant enough not to be left behind. And in that moment, when your worth starts depending on someone else's behavior, you have already handed control of your life to something outside of you without realizing it. You begin to live in a state where every message can lift you, every silence can drop you, and you call it connection, you call it feelings, you call it love. But in reality, it is a system of reactions that you are trapped inside. And the most dangerous part is that it is not obvious, it is not loud, it does not arrive as a dramatic event. It builds slowly, quietly, until you can no longer tell the difference between what you truly feel and how you react to someone else. You start thinking more than necessary, analyzing every word, every pause, every small signal. You begin asking yourself what you did wrong. You adjust yourself to be easier, calmer, less demanding. You try to become the version of yourself that you believe they would not leave. And in that process, you slowly lose the one thing that made you valuable in the first place, yourself. Not because you are weak, but because no one ever taught you how to hold your emotional ground. You were taught how to love, but not how to stay independent. You were taught how to give, but not how to stop. You were taught how to connect, but not how to stand on your own. And that is why when someone enters your life and creates a little emotion, a little attention, a little connection, it does not remain just an experience. It becomes something you attach to, not because they are that extraordinary, but because they touch a space inside you that has never been filled. And you do not realize that what you are chasing is not them. It is the feeling of being acknowledged, the feeling of being seen, the feeling of being chosen. And when you do not have that within yourself, you will search for it outside. You will search for it in how people respond to you, in how they come back, in how they stay. And that is where the loop begins. A loop you cannot fully explain, but you can feel a loop that makes you believe you are getting closer to something, when in reality you are just returning to the same point over and over again. And if you are aware enough, there will be a moment when you realize the problem was never whether they come back or not. The problem is why every time they return, you feel more valuable. And every time they leave, you start doubting yourself. And that is where everything starts to become clear. Not instantly, not easily, but enough for you to begin asking a different question. A question that is no longer about them, but about you. Why do you need someone else to feel enough? And once that question appears, everything begins to shift, because for the first time, you are no longer looking outward for answers. You are turning inward, and you begin to see that maybe, just maybe, what has been holding you in place was never them. It was the way you defined your own worth. And this is where the loop begins, not the kind of loop you notice right away, but the kind you feel without being able to explain it, because it does not look like a pattern. It feels like hope. It feels like possibility. It feels like something almost working. And that is exactly why it is so hard to leave, because every time you think you are about to lose it, something pulls you back in. They come closer, they reply, they show just enough attention to make you believe that maybe this time it will be different. Maybe this time it will stabilize. Maybe this time you will finally feel secure. And in that moment you relax. Your mind calms down. Your chest feels lighter. You tell yourself you were overthinking, you convince yourself that things are improving, but then without warning, they pull away again. Slow replies, less energy, less presence. And suddenly you are back where you started, checking your phone, replaying conversations, trying to figure out what changed, trying to locate the exact moment where it shifted. And this is where confusion begins to take over because there is no clear problem to solve, nothing obvious to fix, just a constant shift between closeness and distance, attention and absence, warmth and silence. And your mind does not handle uncertainty well. So it starts creating explanations. Maybe you said something wrong. Maybe you were too much. Maybe you were not enough. Maybe you should have acted differently. Maybe you should have waited longer. Maybe you should have been more understanding. And slowly, without realizing it, you turn inward in the worst possible way, not for awareness, but for blame. You start adjusting your behavior to prevent the distance from happening again. You become more careful, more controlled, more strategic. You watch what you say, how often you reach out, how much you show. You try to maintain a version of yourself that feels safe, a version that will not trigger their withdrawal. And this is where you lose your natural rhythm, because instead of being yourself, you start managing yourself. And that management becomes exhausting because it never guarantees anything. You can do everything right and still feel them drift away. And when that happens, the emotional impact is even stronger because now it feels personal. Now it feels like proof that something is wrong with you. And that thought stays in your mind longer than it should. It follows you into quiet moments. It shows up when you are alone. It makes you question your worth in ways that go far beyond this one connection. And yet, despite all of this, you do not walk away, not because you enjoy the pain, but because the moments of closeness feel so real, so convincing, so emotionally charged that they override everything else. When they are present, it feels right. It feels aligned. It feels like something meaningful is there, and your mind holds on to those moments. It replays them. It uses them as evidence that this connection has potential, that it is worth fighting for, that it just needs more time, more patience, more understanding. And this is how the loop sustains itself, not through constant pain, but through intermittent relief, just enough connection to keep you invested, just enough distance to keep you chasing. And over time, your emotional state becomes tied to this rhythm. You start anticipating their behavior, reacting before anything even happens, feeling anxious when things are quiet, feeling temporary relief when they return. And without realizing it, your internal stability becomes dependent on something completely unpredictable. And that unpredictability is what keeps you locked in, because your mind is constantly trying to resolve it, constantly trying to find a pattern, constantly trying to regain control. But the truth is, there is no stable pattern, only a cycle. And the more you try to understand it from the outside, the deeper you get pulled into it. Because the real mechanism is not in what they are doing. It is in how your mind is responding. It is in how quickly you attach meaning to their behavior, how deeply you internalize their absence, how strongly you react to their presence. And this is why you can feel so emotionally exhausted without anything clearly dramatic happening, because the battle is not external, it is internal. It is the constant tension between hope and doubt, between belief and uncertainty, between wanting to let go and not being able to. And that tension drains you, not all at once, but gradually, until one day you realize you have been thinking about them more than you have been living your own life. And even then you might not leave, because a part of you still believes that if you just understand it a little more, if you just adjust a little better, if you just hold on a little longer, it will finally make sense. It will finally settle. It will finally become what you thought it could be. And that belief, that quiet, persistent belief, is what keeps the loop alive. What makes this even more dangerous is that it does not start in the present. It starts long before this person ever entered your life, because the way you react right now is not random. It is patterned. And that pattern was built somewhere you were not paying attention to at the time, maybe in moments where attention felt inconsistent, where care felt conditional, where being noticed required effort, where connection was not stable but something you had to earn. And you may not consciously remember those moments, but your nervous system does it learned very early that closeness can disappear without warning, that attention is not guaranteed, that connection is something you have to hold on to tightly before it slips away. And because of that, when you meet someone who gives you just enough closeness to activate that memory, something inside you locks in, not because they are perfect, but because they feel familiar. And familiarity is powerful, even when it is painful, because your mind does not prioritize what is healthy. It prioritizes what it recognizes. And what it recognizes is inconsistency, intensity, unpredictability. So when this person comes close and then pulls away, your system does not reject it. It responds to it. It leans in harder. It becomes more alert, more focused, more invested, because at a deeper level, it is not just about them anymore. It is about resolving something that has been unresolved for a long time. It is about finally getting the stability that was missing before, finally proving that you are enough to be chosen consistently, finally changing an outcome that once made you feel powerless. And this is why logic does not work here. Because you are not operating from logic, you are operating from a conditioned emotional response. Your body reacts before your mind can analyze. Your chest tightens before you can rationalize. Your thoughts start racing before you can slow them down. And you call it overthinking, but it is not just thinking. It is your nervous system trying to predict and control something it does not trust. It is scanning for signs, for shifts, for patterns, for anything that can give you a sense of certainty. But the more uncertain the situation is, the more your system gets activated. And that activation feels like attachment. It feels like depth. It feels like something meaningful. But in reality, it is intensity without stability. And intensity is often mistaken for connection because it is emotional, it is consuming, it pulls your attention in completely. But real connection does not destabilize you. Real connection does not make you question your worth. Real connection does not require constant analysis to feel secure. And yet, when you are used to inconsistency, stability can feel unfamiliar, even boring, because it does not trigger the same emotional spikes. It does not create the same highs and lows. It does not keep your mind occupied. And that is where many people get trapped. They confuse calm with lack of interest. They confuse stability with absence of chemistry. They walk away from what is actually healthy because it does not match the intensity they are used to. And they move toward what feels emotionally charged, even if it drains them, because at least it feels like something. And this is where the pattern reinforces itself, because every time you stay in this dynamic, every time you respond to inconsistency with more effort, more patience, more understanding, you are training your system to accept this as normal. You are reinforcing the idea that connection requires uncertainty, that closeness must be earned. That emotional piece is not the baseline, but the reward. And over time, this becomes your default. You begin to expect instability. You begin to tolerate behaviors that you once would have questioned. You begin to adapt to the cycle instead of stepping out of it. And the most subtle part of all of this is that it feels like you are trying to make things work. It feels like effort. It feels like care. It feels like commitment, but underneath it, there is a different mechanism running, a mechanism that is not about building something real, but about resolving something old. And until that is understood, until you see that your reaction is not just about this person, but about a deeper pattern that has been activated, you will keep trying to fix the situation at the surface. You will keep analyzing their behavior, adjusting your responses, waiting for clarity, waiting for consistency, waiting for something that was never designed to be stable in the first place, because the dynamic itself is built on instability. And the more you try to stabilize it from the outside, the more it pulls you back into the same cycle, because the root is not outside. It is inside, the way your system has learned to associate inconsistency with value, unpredictability with importance, and emotional spikes with connection. And until that association is broken, the pattern will continue, not because you are choosing it consciously, but because it feels like the only way connection has ever worked for you. And this is the part most people never see clearly, because from the outside, it looks like you are just trying harder, being patient, giving things time. But from the inside, something else is happening, something far more powerful and far more dangerous. You are not just emotionally invested, you are chemically hooked, because what you are experiencing is not just a relationship dynamic. It is a reward system that has been activated. And once that system turns on, your behavior starts to change in ways that feel logical to you, but are actually driven by something much deeper. Because every time they come close, every time they respond, every time they give you a moment of attention, your brain releases a small surge of relief, a sense of reward, a feeling that everything is okay again. And that relief is not neutral, it is reinforcing. It teaches your system that staying in this dynamic is worth it, that enduring the confusion is justified because eventually there is a payoff. And the problem is not the reward itself. The problem is the inconsistency of it, because the most addictive patterns are not built on constant reward. They are built on unpredictable reward, moments of connection followed by absence, signals that are just clear enough to keep you hopeful, but never stable enough to make you secure. And this unpredictability is what locks your attention in. It keeps your mind searching, waiting, anticipating, because the next moment of closeness could come at any time, and that possibility is enough to keep you engaged. Even when the overall experience is draining you, and this is why you stay longer than you should, why you tolerate more than you normally would, why you keep trying to understand something that keeps pulling away from clarity, because you are not just trying to make sense of a person, you are responding to a system that is designed to keep you invested, not consciously designed by them, but structurally built into the dynamic itself. And this is where the illusion becomes strongest, because you start to believe that your effort is what will stabilize it, that if you just communicate better, act better, understand more, give more space, be more patient, something will shift, something will click, something will finally become consistent. But what you are actually doing is feeding the cycle, because the more you invest without receiving stability, the more valuable the eventual reward feels, the more meaningful each moment of connection becomes, the more you convince yourself that it must be real, that it must be leading somewhere. Otherwise, why would it feel this strong? And that question keeps you in place, because intensity is being mistaken for truth, for depth, for significance, when in reality it is simply the result of emotional contrast. The swing between absence and presence, amplifying everything you feel. And over time, this contrast reshapes your perception. It makes inconsistency feel normal. It makes unpredictability feel like chemistry. It makes you believe that this is what connection is supposed to feel like: something unstable, something uncertain, something that requires constant emotional engagement to maintain. And once that belief takes hold, you stop questioning the dynamic itself. You start questioning yourself. You stop asking why it is inconsistent. You start asking how you can handle it better, how you can adapt to it, how you can stay inside it without feeling so affected. And that is the trap, because the moment you start adapting to something that is fundamentally unstable, you are no longer trying to build something healthy. You are trying to survive something unhealthy. And survival always requires compromise. You lower your expectations, you justify behaviors, you silence your own discomfort, you ignore signals that would normally tell you to step back, because stepping back now feels like losing something important, something you have already invested so much into. And this is where it becomes even harder to leave, not because the connection is strong in a healthy way, but because the cycle has created an attachment that feels stronger than it actually is, because it has been reinforced through repetition, through emotional highs and lows, through moments that felt meaningful, followed by gaps that made you crave more. And all of this builds a narrative in your mind that there is something here worth holding on to, something that just needs to be unlocked, something that will make all of this make sense eventually. And that narrative is what keeps you in the loop, because as long as you believe there is something to fix, something to improve, something to wait for, you will stay engaged, you will stay invested, You will keep giving your attention to something that is not giving you stability in return. And the hardest truth to accept is that the dynamic itself is the problem, not your effort, not your patience, not your ability to understand, but the structure of the interaction, the inconsistency, the unpredictability, the cycle of reward and withdrawal. And until you see that clearly, you will keep trying to solve it from the inside. You will keep playing a game that was never designed to be won because it does not resolve through effort. It sustains itself through it. And that is why it feels like the more you try, the deeper you get pulled in. Because you are not moving toward resolution, you are reinforcing the very mechanism that is keeping you stuck. And then there is a moment, it does not come loudly, it does not arrive like a sudden realization that changes everything overnight. It is much quieter than that, almost subtle. But once it appears, you cannot unsee it. It usually happens after you have gone through the cycle too many times, after you have replayed the same pattern over and over again, after you have felt the same rise and fall, the same hope and disappointment, the same clarity followed by confusion, until something inside you begins to question not them, but the pattern itself. You start noticing that no matter what you do, the outcome feels strangely similar. You give more, you step back, you communicate, you stay silent, you try different approaches, but the rhythm does not change. The instability remains, the inconsistency repeats. And for the first time, instead of asking what you did wrong, you begin to ask a different question. What if this was never meant to become stable? What if this is not a problem to solve, but a pattern to recognize? And that shift, that small change in perspective, is where your power begins to return. Because as long as you believe the situation can be fixed through effort, you will keep investing in it. You will keep adjusting yourself. You will keep waiting for a different outcome. But the moment you start seeing the pattern as something structural, something that exists independently of your effort, something that does not respond to how well you perform, everything begins to feel different. The urgency starts to fade. The need to analyze every detail becomes less intense. The emotional spikes begin to lose their grip. Not completely, but enough for you to create a small space between what is happening and how you respond to it. And in that space, something important happens. You begin to observe instead of react. You begin to notice the cycle instead of being consumed by it. You begin to see that the closeness is temporary, that the distance always follows, that the return is not a sign of change, but part of the loop. And this awareness is uncomfortable at first because it challenges everything you have been hoping for. It forces you to consider that what you thought had potential may actually be repeating by design. And that realization can feel like loss, not because you are losing them, but because you are losing the story you built around them. The story that told you this could become something stable, something real, something that would eventually make sense. And letting go of that story is not easy because you invested emotion into it. You attached meaning to it. You used it to justify staying. But as the awareness deepens, something else begins to shift. You stop looking at their behavior as a signal of your worth. You stop interpreting their distance as a reflection of something lacking in you. You begin to see that their inconsistency existed before you and would likely exist after you, and that it is not something you created and not something you can control. And this is where the weight starts to lift, because for so long you were carrying responsibility for something that was never yours to carry. You were trying to stabilize something that was not built to be stable. You were trying to earn consistency from a dynamic that operates on inconsistency. And once you see that clearly, the need to prove yourself begins to dissolve. You no longer feel the same pressure to respond perfectly, to say the right thing, to maintain the connection at all costs. Instead, you start to question whether maintaining it is even aligned with what you actually need. And that is a completely different position to be in, because before your focus was on how to keep them, now your focus begins to shift toward what keeping them is costing you. And that question changes everything. because it brings your attention back to yourself, to your emotional state, to your energy, to your peace. And you begin to notice things you were ignoring before, how often you feel anxious, how much mental space this takes up, how frequently your mood depends on something outside your control. And these observations do not immediately free you, but they create distance. And distance is where clarity grows. And clarity is what eventually leads to change, not forced change, not reactive change, but a gradual shift in how you see the situation. And as that shift continues, you may find yourself doing something that once felt impossible. You begin to detach, not because you stopped caring, but because you started seeing clearly. And when you see clearly, you no longer need to hold on to illusions to stay. You can begin to step back slowly, intentionally, without the same emotional pull that once kept you locked in place. And that is the turning point. Not the moment you leave, but the moment you stop believing that staying will give you what you are looking for. And this is where most people expect a strategy, a set of steps, something they can follow to finally break free. But what actually changes everything is not what you do, it is who you become. Because as long as you are trying to manage the situation from the same identity that got trapped in it, you will keep recreating the same experience, just in slightly different forms. And that is why real change does not begin with action. It begins with a shift in how you see yourself, because the version of you that was chasing clarity, waiting for consistency, analyzing every signal, was operating from a place where connection defined value, where attention validated identity, where someone else's presence determined your emotional state. And as long as that foundation remains, no boundary you set will truly hold. No silence you create will feel stable. No distance you take will feel natural, because internally you are still tied to the same need, the need to be chosen, the need to be confirmed, the need to feel enough through someone else. So the first shift is not about them at all. It is about removing the role they were playing in your sense of self. It is about recognizing that the moment your value depends on their response, you are no longer in control of your own emotional state. And reclaiming that control does not mean forcing yourself not to care. It means understanding why you cared in the first place. It means seeing that what felt like attachment was often a response to uncertainty, a reaction to inconsistency, a pull created by something unresolved within you. And once you see that clearly, you stop trying to fight the feeling directly. You stop trying to suppress it. And instead you start changing the meaning behind it. Because the feeling itself is not the problem. It is the interpretation that keeps it alive. When they pull away, instead of asking what you did wrong, you recognize the pattern. When they return, instead of feeling relief as proof of something meaningful, you see it as part of the same cycle. And this shift in interpretation slowly changes your emotional response, not instantly, but consistently, because your mind is no longer feeding the same narrative that kept you attached. And over time, that changes your behavior without forcing it. You respond less, you wait less, you analyze less, not because you are trying to detach, but because the situation no longer triggers the same internal reaction. And this is what real boundaries look like. They are not something you enforce from the outside. They are something that emerges from the inside. When your perception changes, when you no longer see inconsistency as something to fix, you naturally stop investing in it. When you no longer see attention as validation, you stop chasing it. When you no longer interpret distance as rejection, you stop reacting to it. And this is where silence becomes powerful, not as a tactic, not as a way to get a reaction, but as a reflection of your internal state. You are not silent to manipulate the situation. You are silent because you are no longer compelled to fill the space. You are no longer driven by the need to maintain something that does not sustain you. And that kind of silence is different. It is stable. It is grounded. It does not feel like withdrawal. It feels like control and emotional detachment in this context. It's not about becoming cold or distant. It is about removing your dependence on outcomes you cannot control. It is about being able to experience the situation without being defined by it, to see what is happening without needing it to be different. And that is where your power returns, not because the situation changed, but because your relationship to it changed. You are no longer trying to extract meaning from their behavior. You are no longer waiting for something outside of you to settle before you can feel at peace. You begin to generate that stability internally. And once that happens, everything else starts to reorganize around it. Your standards rise without effort. Your tolerance for inconsistency decreases naturally. Your attention shifts back to your own life, your own energy, your own direction. And the dynamic that once felt consuming starts to lose its grip, not because you forced yourself out of it, but because it no longer matches who you are becoming. And that is the real shift, not learning how to leave, but becoming someone who no longer stays in what drains them. And in the end, it does not look like a dramatic exit. It does not look like a final conversation where everything is said and resolved. It is much quieter than that, almost unnoticeable from the outside. But internally, it is one of the most profound shifts you can experience, because what changes is not the situation, it is your relationship to it. You stop waiting, not because you forced yourself to stop, but because the waiting no longer makes sense to you. You stop checking, not because you lack curiosity, but because your emotional state is no longer tied to what you might find. You stop analyzing, not because you suddenly understand everything, but because you no longer need to. And that is the difference. Before you needed answers to feel at peace. Now you can have peace without answers. Before you needed clarity from them. Now you generate clarity from within yourself. And once that happens, something else fades away. The urgency, the constant pull, the feeling that you are about to lose something important, because you begin to see that what you were holding on to was never as stable as it felt. It was a pattern, a cycle, something that repeated itself regardless of how much you invested. And once you see that fully, not just intellectually, but emotionally, the attachment begins to loosen on its own, not all at once, but gradually, naturally, without force. And in that process, you start to reconnect with parts of yourself that were pushed aside. Your focus returns, your energy returns, your sense of direction becomes clearer. And for the first time in a long time, your life is not orbiting around someone else's behavior. It is anchored in your own. And that changes how you move, how you respond, how you choose, because you are no longer trying to maintain something that drains you. You are choosing what aligns with you. And that choice is quiet. It does not need validation. It does not need to be announced. It simply shows up in what you no longer tolerate, in what you no longer chase, in what you no longer feel responsible for. And this is where many people misunderstand the shift. They think it is about losing interest, about becoming detached in a cold or distant way, but that is not what it is. It is about becoming grounded. It is about no longer being pulled by something unstable. It is about no longer needing someone else to behave differently in order for you to feel okay. And that is freedom, not because the world changed, but because your dependence on it did. And once you experience that, even briefly, you begin to understand something that cannot be reversed. You understand that your peace was never on the other side of their consistency. It was always on the other side of your awareness. And that awareness changes what you want. It changes what you are willing to accept. It changes how you define connection, because you can no longer confuse intensity with meaning. You can no longer mistake inconsistency for chemistry. You can no longer justify instability as something worth building on. And that clarity creates a new standard, not one you force, but one that naturally emerges from who you have become. And from that place, something unexpected happens. You no longer feel the same desire for them to come back. Not because you hate them, not because you erase what you felt, but because you see it differently now. You see the pattern, you see the cost, you see what it was doing to you. And once you see that fully, honestly, deeply, the idea of returning to it does not feel like relief. It feels like regression. And maybe that is the final shift. The moment where what once felt like something you needed becomes something you have outgrown. And in that moment, without forcing it, without announcing it, without even needing closure, you move on, not away from them, but back to yourself. And for the first time, you are not hoping they come back. You are not waiting for something to change. You are not holding on to a possibility that never stabilized. Instead, you are standing in something real, something steady, something that does not depend on anyone else's behavior to exist. And maybe for the first time, you are not asking if they will choose you, because you already have.